Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Security, Intelligence and Terrorism series. My guest for today is someone who have been making headlines for the last few weeks with his recent book, someone who served as a former Foreign Secretary of India and National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Mr. Shivshankar Menon is the author of the book Choices Inside Making a Foreign Policy and is out with a new book, which I have over here, India and Asian Geopolitics, published by Penguin. So thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
So the first question I want to ask you is, why did you choose to write this book? And we have seen there has been a huge emphasis on Asia, especially with the contest of dominating the Indo-Pacific. But why is there a sudden interest in the East again? And will this be an Asian century? We know the last 2 decades have not been, but post this, is there an Asian century ahead of us?
Well, I wrote the book because, frankly, I do think that how the world looks and how you deal with it depends on where you are. And we are Asians. Always have been, always will be. And I think Asia has changed a great deal. I think we tend to underestimate how Asian policies have been and how involved we've been in Asia and how Asia has affected our policies. Because, you know, most people study, say, India, US, India, China, India, great powers, you know, some India, Russia. But I wanted to make the point that where you are affects what you do and how you see it very greatly. That was one reason. But the other thing is because Asia is the new center of gravity of the world politics, the world economy, and our future, I think, is intimately tied to what happens in Asia. And vice versa. What happens in Asia also depends on what India does and what happens in India and how India chooses to behave. So I thought it's worth writing a book and at least putting my ideas out there. I don't expect everyone to agree with me. In fact, I think many won't. But at least if it starts a discussion along these lines, I think it would have served some purpose.
Okay.
Will it be the Asian century? That's, you know, very hard to say. It's, you know, it seems logical. You had the European century, which ended with the world wars, which were really European wars, but fought across the world in the Second World War. Then you had the American century. And now if you look at where the world's manufacturing, economic activity is taking place, the most dynamic parts of the world, also where all the geopolitical contention is taking place, it's Asia. So yes, I think it's the Asian century, but not in the sense of, I think, Asia dominating the world and creating a new world system of its own, like, say, Europe did with imperialism, or America did after World War II, creating the Bretton Woods institutions and the whole multilateral structures of the so-called liberal international order. It wasn't, I don't think, very liberal or orderly for us, but that's what they call it. But today, I don't think it's that Asia now has a new order to impose on the world and so on. Not yet, certainly. But yes, Asia will be the predominant region of the world, politically, economically, and ultimately intellectually, and in every other sense as well. So that I expect fully. But it won't be one power dominating the system or creating a brand new system out of devastation, which is what the US did post-World War II.
Okay. So my next question is India's post-independence. As I was reading from your book, I got a sense that the policymakers were really not acutely sensitive towards framing a policy pathway for foreign policy due to the ambit of the Cold War. They don't want to take sides and probably due to other reasons. But when did India finally start taking the dominance and realize that it's time for us to have a strong foreign policy?
I think actually they were very conscious of India's place in the world right from the beginning. It's just that, don't forget, if you think of our condition at independence, it was quite abject. Not just because of partition, but because for the half century before that, the economy hadn't grown. We had been impoverished by a whole century and a half of colonialism and imperialism. I mean, one of the most advanced and prosperous societies on earth had been reduced to one of the most backward, couldn't feed itself, disease was rampant, literacy was 14%, life expectancy around 26 years. I mean, this is a pretty abject condition to be reduced to. And so obviously their priority was at home, and foreign policy was meant to serve that domestic priority of how do I transform India? How do we transform India? But they did realize they can't do this alone, that India needs help from abroad, and they worked with everybody. They chose a non-aligned path because the world was bipolar, but they didn't want to be locked into an alliance, dragged into entanglements, into wars if the alliance got involved. So they chose non-alignment, but they worked with everyone to try and transform India. So even if you look at Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech, independence, he's already talking about our fate being linked to that of the world, and that our tryst is not just for ourselves, but it's for the world itself. So I think they were aware, but their means were very limited. And it's only after, a decade or so of development. But even in that condition in the 50s, we still did play a role in Asian politics, whether it was in the Korean War and the Korean issue as a whole, Indochina, the Vietnam War, the first Vietnam Wars against the French and so on. So we did play a role, even the Formosa Straits crisis between China and the US. And we worked very hard on building up an area of peace in this area. Look at Bandung, look at the Afro-Asian movement, look at the Asian Relations Conference in 1947, March, before we're fully independent. He calls the conference of all the Asian countries. So my own sense is not that they weren't aware or that they didn't want to be involved. It's just that what they could do was limited by the means available to them and by the constraints of the situation around them.
So my question's along the same lines. So like China's behavior in the recent times has been somehow more supportive of, say, Pakistan, and strategies have, practically not been supportive or say aligning with the goals of India as such. So is that a shift that drastically happened post the Indo-US nuclear deal? Like, because before that there was the entire Rawalpindi, Beijing, and Washington nexus that existed, right? So could you explain a little bit about that?
I would actually date it a little later. I think this increased Chinese commitment to Pakistan that we see now, represented by CPC, China and Gwadar, and in fact, $62 billion committed to CPEC, which is a Chinese stake in Pakistani occupation of Indian territory in Kashmir, because many of the projects are there. That kind of stake and the level of commitment, that actually is from roughly 2015, from the Xi Jinping visit to Pakistan. China has always been supportive of Pakistan right through. I mean, she supported Pakistan's nuclear program from the mid-70s, this clandestine search for nuclear weapons. She probably handed over not just nuclear materials and designs, but probably even tested a Pakistani nuclear weapon for them in the early 90s. And she's always been a strong supporter of the Pakistan army right through. But she has never herself got involved in India-Pakistan conflicts, whether it's 65 and so on, 71, even when Pakistan broke up. Instead, she strengthened Pakistan and used Pakistan as a foil and used Pakistan ahead of herself. But that level of commitment that you see now is new. There's no question. Is it a result of stress in India-China relations or a result of closer India-US relations. All these, I'm sure, are factors. But because the basic thrust of the relationship has been the same since the 1963 so-called border agreement that they signed, which gave Shahidullah to China, and related to Indian territory, actually, because it's all about the Kashmir border. Uh, Ever since then, they've actually worked very closely together vis-a-vis India. So I don't see it. And I think the big leap forward actually was 2015. Pakistanis have been saying since 2015 that, oh, China is now committed to the defense of Pakistan and so on. But you know, Bhutto used to say the same, Zulfikar Ali. But it wasn't true. The Pakistanis would like you to believe it because it will deter you and make you think 3 times before you do something with them. But that doesn't mean that it's true. And there's so far no, at least twice Pakistan has proposed a defense treaty to China, and each time China has ducked. So my own sense is that yes, they're working much more closely together today than they have perhaps in the past. But I think there are still limits to China's commitment to Pakistan. And let's see. We have to deal with the situation anyway, and I think we can. I don't think it's impossible.
Another question along same lines. There were 2 instances that like really caught my eye in the book that you mentioned. One was the one that you mentioned, wherein you said that negotiations can happen with regards to borderlines with China. Was a suggestion that you gave to PV Narasimha Rao eventually. And later on, like in recent times, like in 2014, there was an instance that you mentioned wherein Chinese forces again breached borders when Narendra Modi was on a visit to China. And you said a possible reason might be
the other way around, when Xi Jinping was visiting India.
And there was a possible reason that was mentioned. In the first instance, where the suggestion was to negotiate, it was that it was having troubles back home, and it had to manage those troubles back home. On the other hand, the one in 2014, a possible reason was that it was comparatively stable with its neighbors, Vietnam and others, as well as was able to manage its conflicts in the South China Sea. And that might be one of the reasons why the forces might have breached the borders. So do you think that is something like extremely significant, which has impacted China's China's actions towards India and India's foreign policy towards China?
I think China's actions on the border and her policy towards us are a mix of factors. I think it's not just what happens between India and China or the relative balance of power or forces on the border itself. It's also how China sees her situation, how confident she is. I mean, in 1990-91, China was in a difficult position. She'd just gone through Tiananmen in 1989. So there was internal unrest and there was questions. The leadership itself was divided. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. And they were the last big communist state left standing. And the obvious conclusion was, if the West has managed to topple the Soviet Communist Party, next they'll come after us. They'll go for regime change in China. So they were in a beleaguered position. And it therefore made sense for them to come to an accommodation with us. Not a settlement, but an accommodation, saying, I won't bother you, you don't bother me. And we'll both deal with what is more important to us, which for us also worked. 1991, don't forget, we'd just gone through a huge economic crisis. We just started reform. And we were now dealing with a whole new world. No Soviet Union, friend, gone. Unipolar world, US. We had to transform our relations with the US, and we did. And it worked for both of us. And that kept the peace, as it were, the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement, which we signed in 1993, which said both sides will respect the status quo, kept the peace for about 30 years. So yes, I think it's a complex of factors. And I think in any such situation, you need to look at all the various things that affect our thinking, but they also have a whole host of other things which affect them. not just the internal, not just the relative balance of power, not just their external other involvements, but the whole host, I think, how it works together. By 2014, the situation was quite different. In fact, what, what I saw was a China which, after the global financial crisis in 2008, thought their moment had come. They thought the West was in terminal decline, including the US. Of course, it wasn't. I mean, it happened to be that the US actually recovered better than any of the other advanced industrial countries from the crisis. But they thought their time had come, and they were pushing on all fronts, whether it was South China Sea, whether it was on Taiwan, whether it was vis-a-vis Japan with Senkaku Diaoyu in the East China Sea. And so when Xi Jinping came visiting for the first time with the Modi government in September 2014, they also sent 1,000 troops into Chuma, which was an area that both sides think is on their side of the line of actual control. They had never done this before. And the message to me was quite clear. This is a warning that yes, I'm ready to be friendly with you, to pay you a state visit, to make all the right noises, but I can also embarrass you militarily when it suits me. So treat me with respect. Uh, but I think many people didn't want to hear that message. So people started making excuses. No, no, some local commander did this. You know, if it's some local commander, you think Xi Jinping can allow the PLA to act like this? That tomorrow some local commander will fire a nuclear weapon because it suits him? I mean, the party controls the gun. This is a fundamental principle for the CCP. Always has been from Mao Zedong's time onwards. So it's not a new phenomenon. Uh, but I think since then, we've had an escalating series of face-offs, standoffs on the border. And you've seen the crisis last year. In fact, India-China relations are still in crisis today. So for me, it's actually all these factors play when you analyze what they're doing. Yes, what they're doing is the key, but then you need to understand why and where they've come from and why they're doing these things. I've said what I think. There are alternate explanations. I'm sure there are, which, you know, I think, but it's worth thinking these things through and discussing them just to see if we can arrive at an approximation to the truth. We'll never know 100% because they never open their archives, but we should at least apply our minds to it.
Yeah. So I have a question on Afghanistan. I'll move a little bit there. So in the book, in 1970s, India's influence remained largely confined to South Asian region, and you mentioned that as well in the book with the domestic political turmoil that was in there. And in 1979 December, the United States paid scant attention to Indian sensibilities and concern when it chose to forge a renewed strategic alliance with Pakistan. And with keeping that in mind and looking at the situation today, you mentioned in the book as well, and I'll quote, Russia and China today working together with Pakistan in Afghanistan and opposing Americans, the Taliban should be brought in to form the coal, inform the coal into government. And India has invested a lot in Afghanistan. In fact, in 2020 as well, our Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar mentioned in the Afghanistan conference that India will be spending $8 million for building a dam as well. Looking at the amount of expenditure we had and our own probably sensibilities in the region and our own interests in the region, uh, are we moving back to the 1979 period in terms of our power?
No, I don't think so. I Because three things are very different. One is the situation in Afghanistan is very different from what it was in the 70s. Secondly, I mean, frankly, the last 20 years have created an Afghan middle class. It is not the old Afghanistan of warlords and tribes, no longer. There is actually a very different Afghanistan. And the Afghans will have to sort out what kind of political structure and future they have for themselves. But secondly, if you look at what the Marxists used to call the correlation of forces around Afghanistan, you look at the relationships between the powers around Afghanistan, between China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, India, it's very different from what it was in the 70s. and therefore it will impact very differently on Afghanistan itself. So far, the regional powers have had the luxury of letting the Americans do the hard work militarily, whether it's counterinsurgency, fighting the Taliban as they used to do. Now they don't do it anymore. But now they will have to step up because what happens in Afghanistan will affect all of them and will affect them directly, whether it's China and Xinjiang, whether it's the Taliban across the border into Pakistan. Pakistan is being Talibanized, whether it's separatism among the Baloch, which will affect Iran as well. So each of them will now have to step up and get involved politically, at least to hold the ring so that the Afghans can make up their own mind about their political future. Uh, so for me, this is a very different situation from the 70s. And I don't think this is going to, this is a political problem. It's not an engineering problem which has a quick solution and tomorrow, okay, finished. We've solved the problem, we move on. No, it's going to take a while. There are some myths going around. Taliban's about to take over, or that China will be a great beneficiary, or that Pakistan will be great victor out of all this. None of this is true. And for India, we will continue to work with our friends in Afghanistan, who are many, with our friends in the region, and those who share our interests in a stable, democratic, peaceful, non-extremist Afghanistan. I mean, that's what we should be aiming at. And we'll work with whoever we can work with, use whatever influence we have, which is much more than we had in the 70s. I mean, we have means available today, which we didn't have in the 70s and 80s. So I think this is a very different situation from the 70s, and it will not end the same way either.
Okay. So I'll come to smaller regions a little bit. Since you already answered, I had another question on Afghanistan, and you answered it about the myths that are going on of Taliban taking control and India's foreign relation being affected with that. So I'll come into another question about we always believe that regional balancing is definitely the bigger need to be a superpower. And especially we have seen over the last few years under Modi's foreign policy, our foreign relations with smaller countries like Nepal and Bangladesh have taken a hit. Uh, Especially, we have seen from 2016 there have not been any SARC meetings as well. So, do you think can India move ahead, being a superpower, the ambition of being a superpower, without resolving regional issues first? And especially when China is looking at nuclear colonies in Nepal, it's investing in Sri Lanka, and I mean I don't know how much control it has over Pakistan. So can India move ahead like this?
Well, let me break that into three parts. Firstly, is our goal being a superpower or is our goal transforming India? So my sense is that our real goal is transforming India. If that results in India being a superpower, fine, good. If being a superpower helps us to transform India, then good. But that's not our goal in life, to beat other people. That's not our point. We have enough to do at home to take care of our own people, to improve our own condition, to make India into a modern, prosperous, secure society where every Indian can achieve his or her full potential. That's the goal of our policy. Foreign policy, security policy is supposed to enable that, not being a superpower and so on. Secondly, you're absolutely right. The neighborhood is critical because this is our home. And you cannot expect that India will prosper or be secure if the neighborhood is unstable, insecure, and is going down the economic tubes. There's no way that that's possible. So we actually need to work with our neighbors. Smaller, bigger is not the point. We need to work with them and make sure that we have a peaceful territory, which will enable us to transform India, because that's critical as we need it for our own interests. But what has happened now is that South Asia, which was a sort of backwater to global geopolitics during the Cold War, because the main fault line was in Europe, today is in the center of all the action. As I said, the center of gravity of global politics, of economics, is all in Asia. And this is also, therefore, where there is the most contention between the powers, whether it is China versus US established power, China rising power, whether it's maritime contention in the Indo-Pacific, which is critical now for everybody's future, everybody's economics economies depends on what is transported through the Indo-Pacific, or whether it is all the global hotspots and flashpoints today. They're all around us. So therefore, South Asia now becomes important. Today, the US is trying to get Bangladesh to be part of their free and open Indo-Pacific initiative. The Chinese are trying to get Bangladesh and Nepal into the Belt and Road Initiative. Why? Because they see this as part of their global contention and their global role. So South Asia has become, will be naturally attractive to outside powers. And there's an internal pull also, because for our smaller neighbors, their answer to this overwhelming presence of a very large India is to work with external powers, is to find external balancing vis-a-vis India. Exactly what you did with non-alignment between the US and the Soviets. They do between you and China, you and external powers. They try and bring them in. So what we need to, I think, get our heads around is that we cannot say South Asia is going to be our exclusive area and that you can't talk to anybody else. They will. It's in their interest. And you have to understand that. But frankly, we have such affinities of geography, of language, of religion, of culture, of everything, you name it, food, that we should be using these. When I say of geography, for instance, I mean, with Bangladesh, we should be opening up border hearts all along the line. Rather than trying to build fences or calling them termites and so on, we should be actually trying to make the subcontinent into one economic space where India's growth, their growth, Bangladesh has been doing very well for the last few decades. That pulls everybody else together so that you have one big economic space. Our security is interlinked, not just maritime. In the Bay of Bengal, for instance, we should be working with all our partners in the Bay of Bengal and leading the effort to ensure maritime security in these waters. But even other forms of security, we need human security. I mean, you've seen what's happened with the pandemic, with COVID. It doesn't respect any borders. You look at what's happening in Nepal and the Indian side of the Nepal border. It's in Bangladesh, and they rely on India for vaccines. But we need to be part of each other's. We need to be seen as a positive contributor to their security, to their prosperity. And if you work on that basis, then frankly, outside powers can never actually match you in the subcontinent if you're willing to put in this effort. But you need to step up your game considerably. Because, as I said, suddenly the South Asia is no longer a geopolitical backwater in global terms. And it matters. And frankly, South Asia hasn't done badly if you look at the last 3 decades. Especially, I mean, Bangladesh, but India as well. COVID might have put us all back a little bit, but COVID's not going to be there forever. And in the longer term, South Asia has very good prospects. The fundamentals are good. The demographics are good. And we have location. We have a whole set of advantages that we should be using, but we have to do it together.
I have a question along the same lines since we talked about countries in the Pacific. How has India's approach towards getting the look east policy towards the act east policy been helpful in counteractive measures against China? Like, again, as a regional power, I would say, as a country which became stable in the region, maybe earlier than some others. So how?
I think look east was more than, we're going to contain China. No, in fact, when Look East was devised, when Nelson Rao first spoke of it in April 1992, what he meant was that this is the most economically dynamic area in the world. And as we pull our economy out, don't forget, this is just after drastic reform started in India. As we pull our economy out of trouble and we start trying to reach our high growth years, which we did, we want to work with all the countries to our east who are doing the same. We're starting with Japan, with China. We opened relations with Taiwan. not official diplomatic, but short of that, we did everything. With ASEAN, became dialogue partner, etc. And it bore its fruit. And over time, as the situation changed, Look East became more than just an economic outreach as it started. Uh, I think the very rapid rise of China and the shifts in the balance of power, those I think led to similar concerns in several other countries on China's periphery, at least on China's maritime periphery. Uh, and therefore, if you look at our defense, security, intelligence work with, say, Japan, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with Australia, with Singapore, all these countries over the last 20 years, it's really grown phenomenally. So we share a concern at the effects of China's rise and how that's playing out now that we have all these hotspots to deal with in the region, in Asia. Uh, that doesn't mean that we are now locked into some big alliance, some NATO of the East, as the Chinese like to say. No, what we are doing is we share our concerns, we try and work together. There's a level of external balancing, maybe. We have common interests in keeping the maritime security of the Indo-Pacific, keeping it open, safe for the merchant marine, for our trade, for our energy flows. So we work together on our common interests. Now we're working with some of the countries on building resilient supply chains. With other countries, we're working on vaccines. So it's not just, oh, here's a way of containing China. Look East is not designed to contain China. Look East is designed to further Indian interests, along with the countries to our east. And I think that's the way to look at it. Now, we have a China problem. Yes, in fact, now we have a China crisis since last spring, since spring 2020. But that is primarily, there are bits and pieces of that crisis which we will have to deal with ourselves. Nobody else is going to handle security on the LAC, for instance. Nobody else is going to deal with these kinds of issues. Our land, our territorial integrity is something we have to be able to protect. And that goes without saying. But in terms of creating an environment, an order, maritime security, cyber security, things like that, which no one country can do alone, and where you need external partners, we'll work with whoever we can find. And frankly, we're getting more and more partners to work with. You see all kinds of forms of cooperation. I mean, Quad is one, Look East is another, your relationship with ASEAN is another, what you're doing with the US, the foundational agreements. These are all bits and pieces of a much larger pattern of coping with a very different situation in Asia and around us.
So another question with regards to the same progress that we've made, like a difference that we've seen. So you mentioned how after post 9/11, US sort of aligned with India's perspective on terrorism as well, and we kind of had, say, a partnership of sorts, for the lack of the right word, against the entire concept of terrorism. Whereas way down when the Mumbai attacks happened in India, in Taj, we decided to take, as you again mentioned, the first reaction was to retaliate and go for an aggressive approach. But after much deliberation, the right way to go forward was chosen to be to impose, say, diplomatic pressure in other ways. So in those 7 years, like in a span of 7 years, what were the things that changed that caused that shift in, say, the perspective towards the problem?
Well, I think, you know, our views on global terrorism were never entirely aligned with the US. There was, even after 9/11, there was one big difference. We saw the epicenter of global terrorism as Pakistan, and we were very clear about it. Elements of the US establishment started to agree with us after their experience of going into Afghanistan. And by the time they discovered Osama bin Laden in 2011 in Abbottabad in Pakistan, I think it was quite clear to everyone that Pakistan was playing a double game. But there were large parts of the American establishment, including the military, who felt they needed Pakistan in order to fight the war in Afghanistan, and therefore that they couldn't alienate Pakistan, and therefore their view of Pakistan, at least declared, and their practice in Pakistan, very different from ours. Secondly, they chose to go into Iraq. And their Iran policy, for instance, these are not things that we actually aligned with entirely. The Americans were very keen that we send troops into Iraq, for instance, to keep the peace in Mosul, in the Kurdish areas in the north. And there was actually several people in India who thought we should, but finally Mr. Vajpayee decided against it. And he was very clear that this was not, so it's not that our views are entirely aligned. We had congruence. The Americans started seeing international terrorism more like we did. But I don't think they quite ever saw it. Of course, Mumbai, exploded any myth of Pakistani hands-off, non-state actors, all these words that they use to try and maintain a distance. There was no Pakistani deniability after Mumbai. And the Americans knew it, everybody knows it. So for me, therefore, during those 7 years, what happened was we went through our own experience of trying a peace process with Pakistan, finding that even the Pakistani army in charge, the Musharraf in charge, was unable to handle their own internal politics or to actually do anything to actually control the jihadi tanzeems and so on, except temporarily, which they did in 2005-6 for a while. But that within the army itself, and the ISI was clearly involved in Mumbai, in setting up Mumbai, so that there are limits to what you can expect out of Pakistan. And I think that was the biggest learning when you saw the Mumbai train bombings, and you saw a series of escalating events after 2007, where already it was clear that things were getting worse. So yes, I think, but our experience of terrorism, we're not like the US sitting behind two of the world's biggest oceans, in effect a geopolitical island and safe. I mean, look at the shock for the US that 9/11 represented, because it was the first time they'd been attacked on their soil for a century and a half. I mean, it's been a long time since and the thought is just, we don't have that luxury. We've never had that. And we look at these things, therefore, slightly differently, and will continue to. But to the extent that our ideas are aligned, they are congruent rather than aligned, I would say we've managed to increasingly work together in counterterrorism, to share intelligence, to work against them, against terrorist threats against India. And that cooperation actually is going very well with the US. But I think we should never forget with the US that the US is a global superpower. She will have global interests, and not all those interests will be the same as ours. And even where we do have common interests, they will not be 100% identical, which is why we are partners. We're not allies. And we will, I think, stay partners. But the fact is that congruence, that those common interests, those are growing, have been growing for 30 years, have transformed India-US relations, and at least as far as I can see in the near future, are likely to continue to grow.
Yeah. So I have a small follow-up with that. I know you have got this question a lot of times, and every time you go and talk about terrorism, counterterrorism, and Pakistan, this is one question that's asked to you. So I thought, why not resolve this for once and all? You have been the national security advisor during that time when the Mumbai attacks happened,
I
and
was foreign secretary.
you're foreign secretary, my bad. But after that, you were the national security advisor post that. And there were times when we could have retaliated to Pakistan, and when we see right now,
How do you know we didn't?
yeah, but when we see
How do
some,
you know?
uh, I mean, it's not in the media. That's the
But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. What you don't know, it doesn't mean that just because you don't know something, doesn't mean it
yeah.
doesn't happen. No, I
Okay.
think the issue there about retaliation and surgical strikes and so on, frankly, is
Yeah.
quite simple. Why do you do it? Do you do it to to impress your own people, or do you do it to change the behavior of your adversary? If you do it to change the behavior of your adversary, then the moment you announce it, he has no choice but to retaliate or to deny that it happened at all and to produce proof. As he did after Balakot, he just said nothing happened. He killed a few trees. That's it, right?
Mm.
But once you go public, then forget about changing his behavior because he can't afford to be seen by his people as changing his behavior under public pressure. So that's the choice. Governments choose both ways. Sometimes governments choose to go public. Sometimes governments choose not to go public. And so, but I don't think you should assume that the media has everything or that what appears in the media represents reality.
Yeah. But this increasing nature of having an assertive approach and going public with every time Pakistan attacks us, the deep state attacks us, does that mean that we always have to go since this is a trend now?
I can't speak for this government and what it chooses to do or what it will do.
But
I
it is a
can't even
dangerous trend.
my own attitude is you look at the situation, you look at what you want to achieve, and then choose your means accordingly. Choose whether to go public or not, depending on what your goal is. As I said, fundamental choice is, do you want to change his behavior or do you want to win a publicity battle, have a good image, impress your own people, win an election? That's up to you. That's a political choice. But I don't say that one is always right or the other is always right. Well, that's frankly, that's a political choice that people will make at a certain time. Some governments choose one way, others choose the other way. A lot of it comes down to the personality of the people involved, of the leader, and so on.
And
Yeah.
the argument or the fact lies in that UP had more number of attacks compared to the NDA at the moment.
But
Uh,
have they changed Pakistani behavior?
that's the larger point.
And
But
That's the
has
narrative.
it,
That's
and
the narrative.
more important, has it improved the condition of your people? I mean,
yeah,
that's the real question. Has it improved the condition of your people in Kashmir, in Punjab, in other parts of this country? No, I mean, the criminalization of border guarding forces, all that kind of thing, actually, there's a whole set of downstream negatives which come along with the so-called assertive muscular policy, which, but, different governments make different choices.
yeah. So I just have one last question about Pakistan. So currently, when we're looking at Pakistan, uh, we see General Bajwa trying to have a Pervez Musharraf moment where he's trying to solve the problems of the long-standing problems with India at this moment of time where we see, a reassurance of the ceasefire agreement that was done, and we see opening airspace to Imran Khan. Is it like too soon to expect a breakthrough in this uh, dangerous relation that we used to tread in?
You know, Pakistan comes to the table in two circumstances. One is when she has no choice, which is what happened in 2003 4, when, because of the American pressure, the American war in Afghanistan, because of her internal contradictions, uh, General Musharraf actually came into a comprehensive dialogue, into a discussion, and started back channel talks on the hard issues. The other is when she feels that you're in trouble and that you have limited options. Immediately after 62, after you were defeated by the Chinese, by 63, you have Bhutto Swaran Singh talks on Kashmir. When Ziaul Haq has US support, the US is involved in Afghanistan, needs Pakistan, has changed policy, has turned a blind eye to Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. Then what does he do? He comes to watch a cricket match in Jaipur and starts talking to you. Now, why has Pakistan come to us today? Frankly, I don't see them being in a very difficult situation. They have solid Chinese support. They've just made up with Saudi Arabia over the last few days. The US needs them in order to carry out a face-saving exit from Afghanistan, to pull out from there. She's getting financial support from the world to get her economy back up on its feet, and her condition is not as bad as it was 4 years ago, 5 years ago. But which one of these two motives has brought her to the table this time? You'll only know by trying. Talk to them, test them, see which hoops they jump through, which they don't, which hurdles they manage to cross, and then you'll know why they've come. But the rhetoric is always the same. We understand that there's no future in conflict. We need to build peace for the future. We've seen the light. We know that in order to build Pakistan, we need peace with India, etc. Uh, and we've seen this cycle before. So, it's normal, I think, having been through this 3, 4, 5 times in the last 30 years, uh, for people to be cynical.
So my question is, here in the book you have mentioned about the balance of power, and you have said about how the rise of China and other Asian economies, uh, but left its unipolar military to United States. And in that context,
Oh, about the global distribution
the
of power.
global, yeah, the global, yeah. So in that context, if I bring it to India at the moment, with the Asian geopolitics, uh, mostly we see a lot of importance all over the world. It has been given to air power, and mostly it's to the space part. But very few, references have been made to our maritime security domain, which is probably the most important thing to go ahead with. Uh, is it the time we start talking about the maritime importance to Indian subcontinent, especially considering that if India is a peninsular region, and it is one of those places, it's one of the major players in the Indo-Pacific. That's one. The other thing is, I know you don't have a crystal ball to predict the future, but uh, how do you see India's geopolitics and foreign policy shaping in the coming years?
Uh, about maritime security, I think it's very important. And this is why I go through a little bit of history in the beginning and of how my conviction that India has done best when she's most connected to the world and most engaged with the world. And the manner of our participation in the world has been determined by our geography, by having the Indian Ocean, by where we are located at the center of an Indian Ocean world, trading both east and west, and because of the nature of the Indian Ocean as an open ocean, where therefore it's been an ocean where there's been interchange, migration, trade, etc. Ideas have flown, people have been carried across this ocean. But it's not been a battle space in history because it's such an open space. It's not an enclosed sea like the Mediterranean, Black Sea, South China Sea, where actually you've seen battle spaces in history. You've seen battles right through history for control of these closed spaces. So I'm convinced that maritime security is critical to our future. I think, unfortunately, we've been sold a version of our history which minimizes that. But I think increasingly over the last 15, 20 years or so, I think more and more people have come to realize that in India. And I agree with you that I think maritime security is very important. 93% of our trade is carried by sea. Our energy comes by sea, our energy, and we import our energy. We need these things. So there's no way that we can do without it. I mean, think of the calamitous effect that any cutoff of these sea lanes would mean for us and our livelihood. So yes, I agree with you entirely on maritime security. What about the future of India's geopolitical future? I think we are at a moment of choice, and that's what I try and argue at the book in the book. It's very easy to be frightened by all these changes that are happening around us. The world looks very unstable, very uncertain. China is rising. Our relations are getting very difficult with them. And so it's very easy to say, okay, we'll shut our doors and windows and withdraw home. And Atmanirbharta can easily shift into autarky, into, but frankly, almost half your GDP today is the external sector. You need the world. As I said, you need the world for energy, for markets, for technology, for capital. There isn't much that you You need to work with the rest of the world for solutions to your big problems. Maritime security can't be solved by us alone. It affects several countries. You look at most of the challenges today, climate change, these are all transnational challenges which need international cooperation. So you have to get out there and get involved with your neighbors, with other partners, with whoever you can work with. So for me, this is a moment of choice. And we need to, for me, the choice is clear, and that's what the book is an argument for. It's 400 pages arguing for this one thing, saying, please go out and engage with the world and stay connected with the world, because that's where we have always done best, when we have done that in the past. And I still think it's more than necessary today in a globalized world, that you can't do without the world. No matter how unique you think we are, and how exceptional you think we are, and how brilliant you think we are, we still need the world, and we need to work with it.
To be honest, that answers much of the question I was going to ask, because it was going to be around how, through the course of the book, you've traced these choices that leaders make, and in a lot of cases, how their personalities and the context that is in place is of primal importance in taking those particular choices. So, my question was going to be that, does India showcase a sense of responsibility over the period of time while making these choices, not just for herself, but for others as well? And do we in the future need to make sure that that responsibility is kept in mind? So, yeah, it was.
But actually, it's a very good question, because, there's two parts to this. One is how we see it, right? We are a subcontinent. We're the only subcontinent in the world, which means we are a world unto ourselves, but we're also connected. We're part of a bigger continent. And that tension is always there in these choices that each leader makes. Do you make it purely for yourself, or do you think of yourself as part of a larger body, as of something bigger than you? But then you will say, you're an Indian leader. Your primary responsibility is to the Indian people. So why are you taking responsibility for other people's prosperity, security, safety, whatever? You should be thinking only for India, right? India first. This is very attractive to say as a statement. But what if your interests and theirs coincide? What if the best way of pursuing Indian interests is to actually take their interests, some of their interests, into account and work with them? And surely that actually helps you to strengthen your position. Protectionism, the world doesn't work for you, right? But you can't fight protectionism all alone. You want other countries also. So you need to persuade other people. You need to work with others for whom protectionism is also a threat. And you will find partners for that. So for every issue, you can find other partners. I think we are lucky. It's not that our interests are somehow so different from the rest of the world's that we have no partners, that we have no common interests with other people. As I think, Nehru used to use the phrase enlightened self-interest. In other words, you understand your self-interest, but you also see where it coincides with other people's interests, and you work with it. At the broadest level, it's obvious. I mean, we all have an interest in peace. We all have an interest in avoiding nuclear war. Everybody has an interest in economic development. But actually working it out is much more complicated. And that's where I think, that's why this long account of all the choices that leaders have made and so on, maybe it helps you to think of how to deal with these kinds of choices. But I think India is actually in a fortunate position. We can be selfish and still be responsible. We can follow our own self-interest and still do the right thing, because doing the right thing is in our self-interest for most cases. But that's a whole different argument, by the way. It's, that needs another book.
So thank you so much, sir.
For that one also.
No, I'm not writing it. You'll have to write this.
So, but thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show. And I can recommend this book to everyone. And we had a great time reading it, and I hope our audience do as well. Thank you again.